Trump now saying he will double tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel imports. He says it's a response to Ontario, the province of Ontario, placing a 25% surcharge on electricity coming into 3 U.S. neighboring states. And joining us now, the Ontario Premier, Doug Ford. Premier Ford, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, what's your reaction when you heard this latest news?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Wolf. And it's disappointing, and I'll tell you the reason it's disappointing, because Americans are going to pay more. They only have the capacity, the U.S. only has the capacity of producing 16% of the aluminum they need. Pretty well almost the balance comes over 60% comes from Quebec. So costs are going to go up along with aluminum and steel. Let's focus on the real problem, and that's China. You know, bringing transshipments in and costing American and Canadian jobs. I want to make sure that we send more electricity. Well, if I want to send more critical minerals, but there was an unprovoked attack on Canada, on families, on jobs, on businesses. For what reason? You know, the market's speaking loud and clear. Consumer confidence is down. The market's tumbling. You know, there's going to be plants closed in the U.S. Assembly plants will shut down because they won't have the aluminum, or they'll be paying 3 times as much. This is absolute chaos created by one person, and that's Donald Trump, not the American people. I always say Canadians love Americans. I love Americans, and this has to stop. Let's sit around the table and negotiate a new deal, even though he created the deal in the first place.
Yeah, and as someone who grew up in Western New York and Buffalo along the border with Canada, I can honestly say I love Canadians as well. Talk a little bit about Ontario, your province, and the electrical power it shares with the states in the United States along the border. A lot of it is coming from Ontario, right?
That's correct. We power 1.5 million homes and businesses in New York and Michigan and in Minnesota. I just got off the phone with Governor Whitmer. I consider her a friend. We worked together for 7 years. She's a wonderful person, and I apologize to her. She understands. But what I recommend is on the electricity bill, put down this increase is a tariff from Trump. It's a Trump tariff, which is basically a Trump tax.
As you know, you've called this an unprovoked trade and tariff war initiated by the United States against Canada. Trump is saying that Canada pays very little for national security and relies on the U.S. for military protection. What's your response to him on that issue?
I agree that we have to meet our 2% commitment, our NATO commitment. I've said it for years. Other premiers all signed agreements sending it to the federal government. We spend 1.4% on defense. It needs to go up to 2%. We have to pitch in our share. 100%, I agree on the 2%.
Yeah, that's what he's been saying now for the last several years. The NATO allies have to increase their spending to come up to what the U.S. percentage of military spending is. His latest Truth Social post earlier today, Premier, also doubled down on Trump's desire for Canada to become the 51st state of the United States, saying the brilliant O Canada anthem will continue to play. How do Canadians feel about what the President Trump is saying about Canada becoming part of the United States and even allowing O Canada, a beautiful national anthem, to continue playing?
Well, obviously, the Canadians are infuriated, and what it's done, it's united the whole country, and the patriotism is running wild across the country. The likes I've never seen before in my entire life. We'll never become the 51st state. Canada is not for sale, and we want a great trading partner. We had the greatest neighbors in the world, the U.S., and it's not the American people. They didn't vote President Trump in on this type of mandate. He had a mandate to lower inflation, lower cost of living, create more jobs, and it's backfired on him. Inflation's going up, jobs will be lost. He's taking more money out of Americans' pockets. For what reason? We're still trying to figure this out. Let's sit down at the table and negotiate this deal. If there's things he doesn't like, then we sit down and we have a conversation. But just going tit for tat back and forth, all it does is hurt Americans and Canadians. It's unacceptable.
Before I let you go, Premier, I want to ask one final question. Trump is calling on Canada to drop its tariff on dairy products. Is this a realistic request?
Well, it's one of the items that obviously it gets under his skin. Let's sit down and talk about it. That is as simple as that. Let's renegotiate the USMCA. Let's stop the bleeding on both sides of the border as China's sitting there laughing at both countries. Let's sit down and negotiate a fair trade for both countries, and everyone benefits.
Yeah, it's amazing what's going on. Hard to believe. As a kid growing up in Buffalo, New York, along the border with Canada, whenever I would go to a Buffalo Sabres hockey game, they'd always play the U.S. national anthem, but they would always play "O Canada" as well, because so many of the hockey players, almost all of them, were Canadians. And I just remember that as a kid growing up. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, thanks very much for joining us.
We thought it would help to give a bit of a debrief, catch you up. President Trump started his tariff tango with Mexico, Canada, and China on January 31st. He paused it 3 days later for 1 month. The next day, China tariffs took effect. Canada and Mexico followed in March, but just a day after those tariffs took effect, the president announced a carve-out for automakers. A day after that, a 1-month delay for other products. On March 7th, he threatened reciprocal tariffs on Canadian dairy and lumber. That brings us to the announcement that we have been telling you about this morning on steel and aluminum. Okay, digest all that for a second, and now we're going to get an explanation and the ramifications politically from our talented group of reporters here, Sabrina Rodriguez of The Washington Post, CNN's David Chalian, and CNN's Jeff Zeleny. You catch all that? Wow. David Chalian, I'm going to start with you because it is confusing. It is uncertain. It is trademark Donald Trump to govern by chaos, as we've said time and time again. But it is also trademark Donald Trump to care about the markets.
Well, I think that's why you saw some of that whiplash.
Yeah.
Some of that was in response to the markets,
Yep.
right? Not just to inject chaos for chaos's sake. I know he told reporters last week he doesn't watch the markets. I just,
And there's a bridge he can buy.
Exactly. There's absolutely no truth to that. And, he's going later to talk to the Business Roundtable. And, he is clearly getting a lot of input, not just from Republicans on Capitol Hill, but from a lot of the high dollar donor business people, the business community. These folks have inputs into Donald Trump. And I've talked to some Wall Street folks, both supporters of the president and not supporters of the president, all of whom work for these big banks and financial institutions, who say that there's a mood shift right now, and there's real concern in the marketplace. I mean, we see it obviously in what the Dow is doing, but there's a real concern that there is not a long-term plan here.
Yeah, and because you mentioned that, I do want to put up on the screen, the Business Roundtable is a group, a very large group of the CEOs from around the world. What we're putting up on the screen are the CEOs who are on the board. Those are the companies that they represent. We don't know if all of the CEOs from all those companies are going to be there, but presumably a lot of them will be there. That's a meeting about 5 hours from now.
I mean, the reality is that Trump, it's unclear what exactly Trump can say to make them feel better, because we've seen Trump in interview after interview in recent days say, brace for a little bit of turbulence. He said a little turbulence in his address to Congress last week. He said in an interview with Fox News that this is a period of transition. So companies just want to know right now, what can they plan for? And the problem with his haphazard approach to tariffs at the moment is, okay, you give an exemption for 1 month. Businesses can't make decisions off of 1 month from now. They want to know if, okay, but is it going to come off in 6 months? Are you going to keep it in place? What is the long-term plan? And the Trump administration is not giving clear answers about that. Instead, they're playing a blame game where we hear officials saying, this is a residual from the Biden administration. But we're going to hear a lot of CEOs today ask the question, okay, what are the specifics you can give us? And I think there's a question of what can he actually offer?
You set me up perfectly for this quote from Art Hogan, who's the chief market strategist for a wealth management company. Here's what he said to CNN earlier today. This market is just blatantly sick and tired of the back and forth on trade policy. It feels as though the administration continues to move the goalposts. With that much uncertainty, it's impossible for investors to have any confidence, Jeff.
Look, and that sums it up right there. And the reality here is we've also seen something different over the last couple of days. The president has not spoken. Now, in other presidents, it's not unusual to go a day without speaking
Such a good point.
in front of the cameras, but in this president it is. We watched all day long yesterday. The advisors were saying, oh, he's likely to speak at various events, did not speak at all. So far today, the only time he's scheduled to speak is after the markets close. However, his words are sending shockwaves once again to the market. So it's that uncertainty that we've been talking about. But now there is a question of a narrative setting in. Talking to Republican, largely supporters of the president on Wall Street this morning, a couple asked, is he trying to intentionally spark a recession to bring down interest rates? Now, those are actual questions being asked. I would be, that's very risky, and I doubt that's the case. But in the absence of sort of words from officials, we did not see his top economic advisors on the morning shows or anything at all today. So that's what's also so unusual about this communication strategy. But for a president who loves to talk about records, ones that are true and ones that are fabricated, this is a record that he did not want. The record yesterday of the worst day on Wall Street, and it could be repeated today. So that is what is so interesting about this policy. And never mind if we sort of place it in the context in which we are, the spending bill is happening on the Hill. The government is being sort of shrunk. It's all of this. It's contributing to this sort of sense of unease that I was thinking back to the night before he was inaugurated. He was at a rally at Capital One Arena, and he talked about, he said, we're going to call it the Trump effect. The stock market has surged since I've been elected. Let's call it the Trump effect. And now
it did.
It is the Trump effect.
It did.
It's just that it's been all wiped out.
It's
in the
got been,
last
and
2
then
weeks,
some.
3 weeks.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would just note one other thing about the absence of Trump yesterday, which I think makes it even more fascinating. He chose not to speak on a day where obviously everyone was waiting to hear from him, but also on a day where the one administration voice that was speaking was Elon Musk on Fox News. And Donald Trump's aware of that too. So he also knew that by choosing not to speak, he understood what voice would be out there. And I thought that that was an interesting decision.
All right, let's get the reaction from Canada to President Trump's latest tariff threat. Let's bring in our Paula Newton from Ottawa. So Paula, I mean, Canada is in a state of political transition. It was just on Sunday, like literally 2 days ago, that Mark Carney was elected. I mean, I don't even believe he's actually technically, correct me if I'm wrong, been sworn in yet, but he's getting his major first test. He initially thought he'd have until April 2nd to negotiate with the Trump administration. But these tariffs, according to President Trump, are coming into effect as soon as tomorrow. He has said, in trade as in hockey, Canada is going to win. Walk us through what his strategy is going to be here, Paula.
Well, at this point, he hasn't even been given a chance to really develop that strategy. Zane, you are 100% correct. Mark Carney is, in fact, the prime minister designate. Justin Trudeau still remains the prime minister. They are behind closed doors at this hour here in Ottawa trying to hash out a transition, which we believe will happen either Thursday or Friday. In the meantime, as Kevin just pointed out, you have Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, who is the one who speaks for certainly one province, Ontario, but there isn't anyone speaking with that national voice. And that is a problem because it has allowed President Trump and Doug Ford to escalate these things between the two of them. I want to point out when we talk about motives, right? The president, in a follow-up tweet, post on Truth Social, said he's referring to Canada here, will pay a financial price that is so big that it will be read about in history books for years to come. We are starting to see certainly a seriousness and a drive with President Trump that he does want to weaken Canada politically. This is what the Trudeau government has been warning about for weeks, and he is continuing down this road. The problem with it, of course, as both of you know, this will also hurt the United States. Will it hurt the United States as much as Canada? Absolutely not. But again, a warning for American allies here. What he is doing, Donald Trump, is making sure that there is, I would say, a separation now between Canada and the United States, not just when it comes to things economic, but on the table as well, things that are political and political and then defense related as well. And in the midst of all that, yes, you have Mark Carney, who certainly talked a big game on Sunday, but does need to bring some kind of calm and resolution to this so that there is a negotiation. I am told behind the scenes, certainly the Commerce Secretary's officials and the finance officials here are still talking. But when you have Doug Ford as the Ontario Premier going on multiple outlets, including CNN just moments ago, and speaking about this, And then you have the president posting on Truth Social in response. It does not help the negotiations that are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, you can say that again. Paula Newton live for us there. Thank you so much.
Let's bring in Ben Bergman. He's a senior correspondent at Business Insider. Ben, thank you so much for being with us. The volatility index on Wall Street surged yesterday and today. I can't imagine that investors are now feeling good about this new threat for an additional tariff on steel and aluminum from Canada.
Not at all. I'm in Las Vegas for a gathering of AI investors and executives, and it feels like President Trump is playing Russian roulette with the U.S. economy. Usually I wake up and check my 401k account. I've been scared to do it for the last couple days, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. It seems to be getting worse.
I do wonder, this is all obviously from Doug Ford's surcharge on electricity going to 3 U.S. states. He has floated the idea of potentially cutting off electricity to those states altogether. I wonder how far this can go. What might Canada do next?
This is the sort of thing that you study in economics class in college and high school, a trade war. I never thought we'd be seeing this in real life play out day to day. I mean, how many Americans knew that we imported electricity from Canada? And there's a lot of levers. But remember, Canada is much more dependent on U.S. exports than we are on Canadian goods. So as bad as this is for us, it's worse for Canada.
So we understand that Trump is going to be speaking to some top business executives during this forum later today. Is there anything he could say, anything he could share with them that might actually alleviate their concerns?
I think what these business leaders would want to hear is a clear plan and not this turning on and off, because this is the worst thing for business leaders to try to forecast when there's so much uncertainty. And you've seen that in the corporate earnings reports this week, such as Delta Airlines saying that they're forecasting perhaps a recession and reduced consumer demand. And so that their stock dropped about 15%. So this is the worst case for business leaders that had been expecting a soft landing, but now could be a recession later this year.
So that question of a soft landing and a potential recession, the number of job openings grew across several major sectors in January, but then 2 weeks ago we saw jobless claims spike, some 242,000 jobs. What does the job market look like overall? How might it be impacted by this trade war?
Well, I think a lot of people see this as the calm before the storm, because just with DOGE, you have so many government jobs and then the threat of a recession now. I mean, usually the U.S. economy is an aircraft carrier that takes a long time, and there's only so much the president can do. Rarely has the economy been so directly tied to the president, and the president not seeming to care that much about plunging the U.S. economy into a recession for what he sees as greater good later on.
Ben Bergman, thank you so much for the analysis. Appreciate your time.
And we have been keeping an eye on Wall Street right now. Stocks, they're down. Looking at the Dow, down 515 points, or down more than 500 still at this point. Anxiety, of course, uncertainty rattling the markets. Let's turn now to Jeff Stein, White House economic reporter for The Washington Post. Jeff, just this new tariff, the doubled tariff on aluminum and steel, what is that going to mean for everyday Americans?
I mean, I think it's worth taking a step back and saying exactly where we are right now. The Trump administration has moved forward with tariffs on roughly $1 trillion worth of goods. But as you're alluding to, today they announced a doubling of steel and aluminum, which is from Canada, which is a small part of our overall import picture, but comes as the administration is looking to impose tariffs on an additional $2 trillion or so in goods. And I think what Trump is indicating here is that this could still be the very early innings. We're only a few weeks potentially into this trade war, which has already far surpassed the entirety of the trade war that Trump waged during his first term. So we could see higher prices, obviously, for imports for U.S. steel and aluminum. The steel and aluminum makers in the U.S. are happy with this. They think that this could help them, sell domestically, raise their prices. That's why they're happy about it. But it really reinforces that that for all the disruption, all the market declines we've seen, all the investor uncertainty, this could just be sort of like an entree, an appetizer for a much bigger fight to come.
Okay, so if this is an appetizer, let's talk about that. So let's talk about what actually a tariff is, because listening to the White House press briefing, there seemed to be disagreement. You talk to economists, they say this is something that gets passed on to consumers. That is not how Trump seems to see it. We heard Caroline Leavitt stressing that tariffs are a tax hike on a foreign country. They are a tax cut for the American people. Can you fact check that?
Yeah, I mean, a tax cut for the American people. I mean, the Trump administration has had this somewhat convoluted argument that if they raise prices, on foreign imports through tariffs, putting aside the reality of that, which is that, it disproportionately hurts low-income people who are disproportionately dependent on imports for food and other cheap commodities relative to wealthier people, that they could use that as the basis for a cut to the income tax. That's the argument in its most sort of generous form that you could articulate. But the idea that the tariffs themselves are a tax cut, as opposed to a potential precondition for a separate tax or the basis for revenue by which other taxes could be cut, is just not true. So I think you're seeing as Trump gets increasingly serious and as it becomes increasingly clear, much to the shock and dismay of investors and allies and many people in the business community, that this is not an idle threat or a negotiating tool, but that Trump actually believes, right, that tariffs will unlock this new golden age for America, despite their potential effect in manufacturing. As that hardens, as that coarsens, as that reality appears more and more real, the White House has had to adjust its sort of linguistic verbiage and say more and more that tariffs themselves are an unalloyed good. And that, really stretches the bounds of what reporters can go without fact-checking, because even if you want to take seriously the arguments that, many Democrats have made too, that tariffs can be a useful tool to change trade practices or to, protect certain critical domestic industries, even if we want to recognize the validity of that, it calls into question whether we can continue to extend that sort of fair debate when they're using sort of language in ways that defy all understanding of economists and nonpartisan experts and what people have been saying.
And then just real quick, Jeff, before we go, she also cited a Canadian tariff on American cheese and butter that isn't actually in effect. This is sort of a tariff that would be triggered if American exports hit a certain point, but they're far from that. This particular one on cheese and butter, but in any dairy category, we don't see that being hit. What do you make of them citing a tariff that, it's like hypothetically, it's almost 300%, but it's not actually in effect. People aren't paying it.
Yeah, the Trump administration and the economists close to Trump have been arguing, and correctly to some degree, that there are imbalances in the global trade system, and more particularly that the U.S. export markets, the U.S. exporters are tariffed more heavily than we tariff imports into our markets. And that was a choice, right, that's been made for the last 20, 30 years, the WTO, that was a choice that the U.S. made. And while there is some reality to that, one, that decision was made with upsides as well for U.S. consumers who wanted cheap imports, but also, while it is true that the U.S. has lower imports relative to other countries on ours, for a country of our size, it's not really the case that that's true for developed countries. When you look at all countries, a lot of sort of poorer developing countries, low-income countries, have higher tariffs at that stage of development, which is frankly also what we had sort of in the era that Trump likes to talk about, the late 19th century or the middle of the 19th century, when we were growing and trying to incubate domestic industries. But now that we are sort of an advanced domestic, modern first world country, our tariffs have come down much as they have in other parts of the developed world. So comparing us now to where we were, 150 years ago, or where many other countries are today, is not sort of capturing the full story of this imbalance that they want to present between the U.S. and other countries' sort of tariff policies.
Jeff, thank you so much for taking us through that. We appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Boris?
Canada's next Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is denouncing President Trump's latest trade threat. In a post on social media, Carney wrote in part that Trump's tariffs are, quote, an attack on Canadian workers, families, and businesses. He adds, my government will ensure our response has maximum impact in the U.S. and minimal impact here in Canada while supporting the workers impacted. With us now is Yvonne Baker, a member of Canada's Parliament. Yvonne, thank you so much for being with us. I want to start with your reaction to the press secretary at the White House saying that Trump's tariffs are a response to, quote, the fact that Canada has been ripping off the United States of America's hardworking Americans for decades. Do you believe that's the case?
That's absolutely untrue. Let's be frank here. The relationship between Canada and the United States, both economically and militarily, has been one of the most successful in history for both Americans and for Canadians. So what Donald Trump's doing in terms of threatening to annex Canada, starting this tariff war, is violating that partnership, and it's going to harm Canadians, but it's also going to harm Americans. And this is completely unprovoked. It's really important for your viewers to understand that. The retaliatory measures that our government is taking is only in retaliation. It's only in response to the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed on us. And I think I need to be clear here with your American viewers that, look, Canada is a smaller country economically and by population than the United States, but we are just as proud of our country as you are of yours, and we are just as prepared to do what it takes to protect it. And so the measures that Canada is taking in response to the unprovoked tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on us are meant to do just that, to protect our sovereignty and to protect our economy.